Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're putting on our independent financial analyst hats to break down the mechanics behind some of the most massive financial crises in history. Specifically, we're looking at the complex financial instruments that major institutions, with a big focus on Goldman Sachs history, have utilized to navigate and, quite frankly, often profit from major market crashes. We're skipping the jargon today. We're getting right into the how, the what, and the actual math behind these monumental economic shifts. Here's our agenda. We'll start with a brief analysis overview, unpack the 1929 pyramid model, dive into real estate securitization, detail the mechanics of futures contract manipulation, and finish up by looking at some systemic structural flaws. All right, Section 1, Goldman Analysis Brief. We're mapping out over a century of financial evolution here, creating a timeline of major market shocks. We'll trace the trajectory right from the 1929 stock market crash through the 2000 dot-com bubble burst and straight into the dual crises of 2008, both the housing meltdown and that massive crude oil price shock. What we're doing as independent analysts is looking for the exact patterns in how financial instruments are adapted to leverage these specific volatility events. Moving right into Section 2, the 1929 pyramid model. Way before anyone was talking about modern crypto tokens or mortgage-backed securities, the absolutely hyped financial tool of the 1920s was the investment trust. Essentially, firms pulled capital from the everyday public into these trusts. You can think of it kind of like a giant community piggy bank. But what's truly fascinating from an analytical standpoint is how these trusts were mechanically manipulated to exponentially multiply leverage. So here's how they actually stacked this thing. First, Goldman created the GS Trading Corp, sold those shares to the public at a premium, and then immediately repurchased their own shares to artificially punk the price higher. Then the real pyramid structure takes shape. They used that inflated capital to launch the Shenandoah Corporation, and then used that to launch the Blue Ridge Corporation. Get this. Blue Ridge issued 7.25 million shares, and they were mostly owned by Shenandoah, which was in turn owned by Goldman Trading. The entire massive structure was just propped up by public capital flowing upward. But as any analyst will tell you, leverage works both ways. When the 1929 crash finally hit, this highly interconnected pyramid completely collapsed under its own weight. We're talking about wiping out the equivalent of $475 billion in today's money. Now, while the bank obviously took a massive hit, the sheer scale of the wipeout entirely destroyed their smaller competitors. It effectively cleared the playing field overnight, granting the surviving massive institutions a near monopoly on investment banking for decades to come. Which brings us to Section 3, Real Estate Securitization. Before we jump into mortgages, we really have to look at the rulebook. From the 1930s all the way to the 1980s, underwriting regulations were incredibly strict. Companies literally needed years of proven profits just to go public. But in the 1990s, under Treasury Secretary and former Goldman co-chairman Robert Rubin, those regulations were loosened. That single shift allowed investment banks to take completely unproven dot-com startups to the mass market. And when that bubble burst, well, the exact same loosened philosophy was just applied to the housing market, completely stripping away the requirements for down payments, stable income, and credit scores. To truly understand the 2008 housing crisis, we have to break down the dual engine of the crash. First, you have mortgage-backed securities. This is taking thousands of those highly risky home loans, bundling them all together, and selling them to investors as premium, safe products. But the real genius and the absolute danger was in credit default swaps. These were basically insurance policies. Institutions would build and sell the bundles of bad mortgages, and then immediately buy insurance from companies like AIG against those exact same bundles failing. It's literally like selling someone a house made of matchsticks and then buying fire insurance on it yourself. And inevitably, when those underlying mortgages defaulted, the insurance had to pay out. During the peak of the crash, the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, Henry Paulson, happened to be the U.S. Treasury Secretary. Under his oversight, competitor Lehman Brothers was allowed to completely fail, but AIG was bailed out by the government using taxpayer funds. This massive cash injection ensured that AIG had the exact liquidity they needed to pay a staggering $13 billion insurance payout directly to Goldman Sachs. The bet against their own products played out perfectly. Let's look at Section 4, Futures Contract Manipulation. Following that devastating housing collapse, capital rapidly migrated over to tangible commodities. The new instrument of choice? The futures contract. At its core, this is simply an agreement to buy or sell a commodity, like oil, at a predetermined price on a specific future date. But post-2008, major institutions shifted this tool completely away from, say, farmers or airlines trying to lock in their operating prices. They turned it into a massive speculative engine. By bringing in massive pension funds to buy oil strictly on paper, they completely detached the oil market from actual physical supply and demand, moving it into a realm of pure financial speculation. 27, I really want you to think about that number for a second. To highlight the sheer scale of this paper trading, by 2008, a single physical barrel of oil was traded an average of 27 times before it was ever actually delivered to a refinery. Every single time that paper contract changed hands, the speculative price ticked up. Now keep in mind, the supply of actual crude oil was increasing globally, and physical demand was decreasing. In any normal market, prices should have absolutely plummeted. But because of this insane speculative loop, the exact opposite happened. Driven entirely by this institutional futures trading, the price of crude oil was artificially inflated to an agonizing $147 a barrel. Then, in mid-2008, when the major institutions decided it was finally time to cash out and exit their positions, the entire paper market just collapsed. The price violently crashed all the way down to $33 a barrel. Look, this wasn't a natural market cycle at all. It was a completely artificial spike and crash dictated entirely by the sheer volume of paper futures contracts. And the mechanics of this manipulation had absolutely devastating real-world impacts. When the major banks exited their positions and the price crashed, it was regular investors who were left holding the bag. The California Public Employees Retirement System, CalPERS, lost $1.1 billion of public pension money. Furthermore, that artificial spike to $147 a barrel pushed global food production and transportation costs so incredibly high that it directly forced an estimated 100 million people globally into hunger. The financial instruments might be abstract, but I assure you the consequences are incredibly tangible. Finally, Section 5, Systemic Structural Flaws. We very rarely get a genuine look behind the curtain, but a highly public resignation letter by former Goldman Vice President Greg Smith revealed a pretty troubling internal culture. He described a business model built entirely on information asymmetry. The core strategy involved taking the absolute most complex products, like those bundled mortgages we just discussed, and selling them to less sophisticated clients, who were internally referred to as Muppets. Essentially, institutions were actively utilizing their superior market data to bet their own money against the very products they were convincing their clients to buy. So you might be wondering, how does a system like this maintain itself without regulatory intervention? Well, it's widely known as the revolving door phenomenon. Just look at the key players. Henry Paulson, former CEO turned Treasury Secretary who oversaw the 2008 bailout. Robert Rubin, who loosened the initial underwriting rules. Steve Mnuchin, another Treasury Secretary. Robert Solek at the World Bank. Mario Draghi at the European Central Bank. In total, over 26 alumni have moved directly from creating and profiting off these highly complex financial instruments right into the highest government positions meant to regulate them. So as we wrap up this explainer, analyzing everything from those 1929 pyramid trusts to the 2008 oil futures manipulation, I want to leave you with this final structural question to ponder. If the exact same architects of these complex financial instruments consistently become the regulators overseeing them, can the market ever truly protect the independent investor? Understanding the mechanics of these historical events is absolutely your first and best defense. Keep analyzing the data, stay curious, and we'll see you in the next explainer.